This next panel is very, very important. As we have a little bit of a rowdy crowd that's here in Chicago out there, but we're going to still keep going for those online. When you're doing conferences and looking at what kind of speakers you want to have, there's a couple things that go through your head. One is, do we want to have maybe conflict on stage or not? And do we shy away from topics that everybody's talking about, like politics? And our answer is no. And I don't think we're going to have conflict on the stage, as we'll have a good, healthy discussion. So when we started to curate some of the speakers, we looked at how politics is playing a huge role today in what millennials are doing, and not only getting involved or lack thereof. There's a lot of talk around bipartisanship and so forth. And so it was important that we teamed up with a good friend of mine, as well as the Case Foundation's Stephen Alacara. Stephen was just awarded the Millennial of the Year. What a title. I bet it's a tough one. He's got a whole year with that title. But he's the Millennial of the Year. He runs the Millennial Action Project. If you don't know about them and you care about politics and you are a millennial, you need to make sure and get on their list. The Millennial Action Project is working on both sides, talking with all different kinds of people who are in politics, legislation, and so forth, about what we can do to change what we're seeing right now in politics overall. So I'm excited to introduce Stephen. Stephen, yes. So tell me a little bit more about the Millennial Action Project.
Well, as many of you know, the levels of polarization and gridlock in our democracy are at extreme levels. So we founded the Millennial Action Project to make cooperation the governing paradigm of millennials as they take the reins of our government. So we work with millennial policymakers all across the country, both in Congress, state legislatures, city councils, and mayors, to really foster that bipartisanship that you talked about and find new areas of common ground.
Cool. So anything exciting we should know coming up from you guys?
Well, we've actually just produced two of our first pieces of bipartisan legislation in the United States Congress, one on immigration and the second on social impact bonds. And we're also scaling this model all across the country and the states. So we have a number of launch events coming up. It could be in your state at home. So go onto our website, millennialaction.org, and you can get the details there.
Wonderful. All right, so have at it.
Thanks, Derek. All right. Well, we have a stellar panel today. We're fortunate to have two of the most influential millennials in American politics and policy today. So let me just introduce them. To my immediate right, we have Carrie Sheffield, who is a writer and broadcaster in Manhattan and an online columnist with Forbes covering political economy. She began her career in Washington with the late columnist Robert Novak after covering Congress for the Hill newspaper. She was also a founding reporter at Politico and later wrote editorials for the Washington Times. Before politics, she had a stint in the financial services industry, working at Moody's and Goldman Sachs. She holds a Master's of Public Policy from Harvard and her bachelor's from BYU. Carrie, we're excited to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
To her right, we have Michael Tubbs. In 2012, Michael Tubbs became the youngest city councilman in Stockton's history, in Stockton, California, earning more than 60% of the citywide vote. Prior to that, he interned at Google and the White House, and he's also a Truman Scholar. Recently, a documentary came out about his incredible campaign in the city of Stockton, and it's called True Son. All of you should check this out. The documentary recently premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. Michael Tubbs is also the founder of an incredible nonprofit called the Phoenix Scholars, and he's been honored as Black Enterprise's top 4 power players under 40, The Root's top 25 under 25, and one of Reader's Digest's 50 Things to Love About America. Guys, thank you so much for joining us, and we have the chance to cover a lot of ground here. And the reason is because Carrie works at the national level, commenting and shaping the contours of our national debate. But Michael here is on the ground. He is focusing on how these policies actually get implemented and affect people on a day-to-day basis. So we're going to have a lot of fun with this. And as we are going through these questions, you can actually engage online through the website. I have, in typical millennial fashion here, an iPad and I will be reviewing these questions, and I'll make sure to weave those in as the conversation progresses. So, let's start with how each of you got involved. Why did you decide to get involved in politics and policy, and what was really driving you? So tell us a little bit about your story. We'll start with Carrie.
Sure. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, and it's great to be here in this room. I understand the deck is a little bit stacked against me as a conservative. I know a lot of people probably didn't vote for my main man, Mitt Romney, but we here in America, we do love underdogs, so at least I've got that going for me that I'm an underdog. So I grew up in a very red state family. So my grandfather was a Republican whip in the Utah legislature, one of the reddest states in the union. So I grew up immersed in these ideas in conservative philosophy and conservative thinking. And I got a degree in journalism from Brigham Young, and I moved to Washington as a reporter. So I was a mainstream reporter for The Hill and Politico. And what that meant was that I had to leave my ideology at the door. I had to be an objective reporter, and I had to report on both sides, multiple facets, and I had to leave the opinion out of it. And for me, it was great. It was a great experience, and I really learned to interact at a personal level and to look at policy from a personal level. So for the first time in my life, I was sitting across the table, for example, in 2007, when the Democrats took over Congress and Nancy Pelosi rose to speakership. There was a movement to bring up the Equal Rights Amendment, which is a key cause for the feminist groups. And I was raised in a household where feminists were akin to the devil, and it was basically people who were trying to really destroy what brought, our country to be the most prosperous and generous country in America, or in the world. And here I was sitting across the table from feminist leaders like Eleanor Smeal, Kim Gandy from the Feminist Majority Alliance, from the National Organization of Women, and I was sitting across the table and I saw that what I had been told was not true, in the sense that these women had very powerful messages. They were very motivated with good intention for what they were trying to do. And that really shaped my thinking, and it made me appreciate at the human level. And I think we at the millennial generation, we can interact more at that human level. I think we have that sort of baked into our ethos and in our generation. So anyway, that's my backstory and sort of what brought me here today and who I am.
That's great. Now, we're going to switch gears here to Michael, and I'm just going to embarrass him for a second here. When he started his campaign, a particular individual decided to donate to it, and she'd only made 2 prior contributions to his campaign, one to the Senator Cory Booker and the other to President Obama. So that was Oprah Winfrey, who directly supported your campaign. So I just had to say that. But tell us a little bit about how you got how you got into politics.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me and for putting me on this panel. It's always hard to go after an introduction, because you read your introduction, 50 things to love about America. If you don't walk on water, it's a disappointment. Then you go after someone like Ms. Carey, and it's like I have nothing important or meaningful to say. But my name is Michael Tubbs. I'm from Stockton, California, born and raised, and I actually hated politics and politicians, honestly. I remember when I got to college, I was really about this grassroots activism, movement work, movement building, and real advocacy. So I was used to yelling at government officials or yelling at the government, saying, you're not doing this, why isn't this being done, and holding people accountable. So I thought that was the path I was going to be on. And then my junior year, I was able to work in the White House in intergovernmental affairs. And I was on a team that did outreach to mayors and councils nationwide. So I spent like 12 hours a day Googling mayors, right? It's the most boring thing I've ever done, but I learned so much. I hated it. I was like, what's going on in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania? Who cares? But besides the people there, of course. So doing that, I said, wow, you could really make an impact at a local level. People need to get involved in local politics, and Stockton has its challenges and had its challenges. And I said, I'm gonna find good people to run back home. And then around the same time, there's a spike in violence. One of my cousins was actually a victim of a homicide there. So they having to go back to the funeral and trying to make sense of life in terms of, okay, I'm at Stanford, I'm at the White House, I have all these opportunities for me, but my family's back home literally dying. Like, I'm helping the administration talk to mayors and councils, but my mayor and council can't figure out how to keep my family safe. And it just had this like 21-year-old angst and like survivor's guilt and all these issues. So then I decided to run for city council. That's the story.
And what was it? Now, it's always a serious decision to run for office. Do you want to just briefly speak to how you finally made that last decision?
Yeah, I mean, it was December of my senior year. I had an interview with like a lot of the top things, and I just it didn't feel right. So I went home and said, okay, if I lose, I have 2 degrees to fall back on, so I'm gonna get a job. So why not run for my senior year? And that's literally how I decided to run. I'm more serious now as elected, but when I was running, I was just like, let's just do it.
Nice, nice. So let's get into how this millennial generation is really shaping our notions of progressivism and conservatism. I would love to hear from you, Carrie. How do you describe the emerging millennial conservatism, and how does that connect with the current Republican Party? Do you think the Republican Party is going to need to change to better engage millennial conservatives?
Yeah, so I mean, I think millennial conservatives, I mean, I think we're the same as millennials of any stripe. You know, we hope for a better future, we want progress. We have different ways to get there. I think millennial conservatives are very concerned about economic progress, about economic growth, and that's, you know, the bedrock of conservative ideology in the Republican Party is that through growth, that is how we eliminate poverty. That is how we create strong communities. That is how we help grow strong families. So I think it's interesting. We were talking earlier about, you know, millennials and what makes them different from any other generation, and whether that's sort of just a shorthand way for the media to refer to our generation. So I think it's interesting that, for me, I just think of it as I'm a human being. I happen to have been born in this cohort, so I just, I don't know. I think we all want the same thing, and I think sometimes people forget that.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And Michael, if you want to speak to the Democratic Party, do you think the Democrats are going to have to change for this new millennial wave?
So how do you even know I'm a Democrat?
I don't.
Okay. I am, but I'm just...
Okay. Could be independent. Well, a lot of city officials are nonpartisan.
So, allegedly.
Allegedly.
And I'm technically registered independent, FYI.
Yeah. Glad I cleared that up.
But to answer your question, I in no way can speak for the Democratic Party. I'm not a Democratic Party official. I just happen to vote that way reliably. But I would say, I think in terms of millennials, I would characterize as almost pragmatic progressives, and that we are very, at least my cohort of people who I do policy with, we're very liberal. We all want the same thing. We believe in shared opportunities, shared growth, shared expansion, but I think we're much more pragmatic in how to get there in terms of, okay, who do I need to work with? I have to work with someone who may watch Fox News and love Sean Hannity. If that's what it's going to take to get it passed, let's do it.
Great, great. Let's talk about how millennials are directly participating in politics. And we're going to have, again, 2 different perspectives here. Let's start with you, Michael. We were talking earlier about your campaign and the integral role that millennials did play, not necessarily as voters, because you were saying there isn't a large millennial voting bloc in your district, but as campaign volunteers, as organizers, as fresh energy to your campaign. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I would say I think millennials contributed to my campaign up and down. My field director was a 21-year-old college graduate who did some work with OFA, decided to come back to Stockton and run the field. We had 20 to 30 young people knocking on doors every weekend. Like, we had 12-year-old girls who were triplets, and they would go knock on doors together as a group of 3. We had 15, 16-year-olds who thought they could get community service hours, even though they couldn't, but they would come anyway and knock on doors. We had college students who just wanted something to do. It was really kind of a very special moment, because especially in local campaigns in Stockton, a lot of the young people are disengaged and not involved. So to see 16 and 17-year-olds knocking on doors and running from dogs and getting chased and things of that sort for this idea of democracy and for this idea that our community could be better was inspiring to even a lot of older people, and got them to become engaged and involved as well.
Nice. Now, one thing I love about Carrie is when she'll write for an outlet, say Forbes, she'll get tons of comments. And I think actually enjoys engaging directly with people, and you'll see in her articles, she will make a very concerted effort to reply to each and every comment, ones that are making at least relatively cogent arguments.
Great.
So maybe you could...
Not the ones where your forehead is bigger than your neck and you're a moron. People like to say that to
Right,
me.
and
I have a big Irish potato head, so.
So maybe you could just speak to just how millennials are participating directly online, and do you think this is a productive, exercise to have these online conversations?
Yeah, no, I think the internet is great. I think it really is sort of this. It creates a there's power asymmetry historically when you look at the media, sort of the old guard of who controlled the message in America. You had the three major networks: CBS, NBC, ABC, and sort of this old school approach to media and the conversation about democracy. And I think new media really opens the floodgates to participation at all levels, no matter where you are. If you look at the data, I mean, the right is lagging behind in terms of, there is a generational gap, I would say, if you look at who goes into the voting booth. I mean, and I like to say that, as people get older, as they get older, they get more conservative, which means they're more, experienced, they're wiser. So if you want to be a hipster on the cutting edge and be against counterculture, the young people, get in on the conservative side. And yeah, because right now to be a conservative on campus, you're sort of not cool. But since hipsters are all about being counterculture, be a conservative and see how that goes.
Conservative hipsters. That might be onto something.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think the libertarian kind of group online, younger people that are more engaged in politics on the right, a lot of them come from that libertarian perspective, and they're very, very active online. So like Ron Paul, Rand Paul, I mean, they are super, super active online.
Michael, we were talking earlier about how this notion of being a millennial on the city council has had maybe a bit of a counterintuitive impact, because I think one would probably think that being a millennial means that and being one of the youngest, you're currently the youngest member of the city council, there might be questions around seriousness or whether ideas are taken seriously or taken credibly. But you had an interesting approach of how you do work with the more elder members of your council. And I was wondering if you could put us in the driver's seat. You go to a meeting and you're passionate about a range of issues. How do you advance policy working with a body that is substantially older than you?
This is a loaded question. I think it depends on the policy. So I'll take, for example, last year I was really adamant about getting ban-the-box passed. And for those of you that don't know, ban-the-box is just allowing ex-offenders the opportunity to apply for jobs, because oftentimes it's the question about a record will depress them from applying, even though they may be qualified for the job. So it's a simple fix. So I go to the city manager and I say, man, I'm getting beat up out there today. And he starts laughing. Oh, why? What happened? I'm like, these people are yelling at me, talking about we have to give ex-offenders jobs. He was like, that's an interesting problem. And I said, but there's a policy I researched. And then, so it's like, I put myself, because oftentimes I think the knock younger people get, especially in positions of power, that we have some sort of arrogance or sense of entitlement. So I make a very concerted effort to always approach things as a student, because I am still learning. So I said, so why don't we have this policy in Stockton like they have in Berkeley? Explain that to me. He's like, I don't know, it's like the HR director. So he calls the HR director in. And she was like, I don't know why we don't. I'll do some research. And then just talking to my colleagues. So I think to answer your question shortly, it's just being really collaborative and understanding that even though I'm young and I could use Google, I could tweet, and I could Instagram better than anybody else on council, that everyone has gifts and talents and skills, and I need them to help govern. And I also think that being young, but also being incredibly hardworking, being at all the meetings, doing my homework, doing my research, and asking the right questions, and not being afraid to disagree or to be out in front really has earned respect. So now my age is viewed as an asset.
Carrie, when you first started writing for Politico, you had to have been one of the youngest reporters there too. Could you share a little bit about that experience? First of all, what made you decide to work for Politico, but then also how did the other reporters react?
Well, there were actually a lot of other reporters who were about my same age, I would say. Well, actually, it's interesting if you want to know the backstory of Politico.
Yeah, tell us.
So Politico was actually Capital Leader before it was Politico. So the backstory is the Robert Alberton family, who owns Politico. They decided they wanted to run or create a Capitol Hill-centric publication for Capitol Hill only, and they called it Capitol Leader. This is how I got hired, and it was a bunch of people actually my age, and they then decided they were able to bring on these mid-career journalists from the Washington Post, Jim Van High and John Harris, and those guys said, we want to broaden the coverage, not just to Capitol Hill only, we want to do all of politics. So they actually changed the name to Politico. So we actually had a lot of young people who were brought in and expected to only cover Congress. All of a sudden we were thrown into the Politico mix, and we had to cover a much broader spectrum of politics. So so I actually have business cards from Capitol Leader. So that's the backstory. But it was a startup. It was crazy, as every startup you hear about is. Just a lot of energy, it was really interesting to watch a media brand being created from the ground up. So it was launched in 2007, and it was so interesting to me because it literally came from nowhere. And what made it successful was that the people who were creating it were coming from the Washington Post. They had long, successful careers. They knew everybody in politics and in Congress. So it was really based on their strength and their connections and who they were able to bring in terms of their team. So it really convinced me as to the importance of the team that you bring on with your startup. So it was fast-paced. It was exciting.
Very cool. And also, just going back a step in your story, we were talking about the transition from working in the financial services realm to the political realm. Do you want to speak to that a little bit? What inspired that shift? Because one thing that I think a lot about is how are we making sure that our generation's best and brightest are going into politics and policy-type careers? And so I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I actually worked in journalism first, and then I went to grad school, and then I worked in finance, so it was actually sort of the other way. And then I came back to politics because I'm a masochist and I just, I think having experience in the financial sector made me a better journalist. And so when I went to the Kennedy School, I went in with the perspective, I want to broaden my horizons. So I had started in media. I had a journalism degree, went to DC as a journalist. Then I went to grad school, and I said, I want to expose myself to ideas that I have never been exposed to. So I chose to study business policy. I had a musician father. I grew up just being sort of, I don't like business people, the suits, so I had sort of a natural aversion to the idea of big business or crony capitalism. So I said, you know what, I need to understand, this was during the financial crisis, and so in grad school I said, I don't even know what a derivative is. I don't know what a mortgage-backed security is. I need to understand what this means because it is shaping our world. And so I studied that in graduate school. I studied capital market regulation, economics, finance, just to understand what was happening with the financial crisis. And the more I studied, the more I said, you know what, I'm actually kind of interested in this. And so I decided to work in finance. And so I worked at Goldman Sachs as a credit analyst. And I went into finance thinking, you know what, I could either really, really enjoy this and maybe start my own fund someday, or just learn a lot and go back into journalism. And that's what ended up happening. So I would say that my experience as a bond analyst, I also worked at Moody's after working at Goldman Sachs. My experience working in finance, I think, really sharpened my analysis skills because I now think about this, policy that we're going to implement. What does it mean from a different perspective in terms of analysis? So, for example, like the minimum wage. If we think about minimum wage, it sounds like a really great idea in terms of helping alleviate poverty, but if you look at the finances of it, if you look at it as an economist, it is actually really detrimental to the most vulnerable members of society. If you look at people who work in minimum wage, the people who are most likely to be laid off because of a minimum wage increase is Hispanic, African Americans, and young people. And so it seems counterintuitive because you think, oh, it's so great to help people who are vulnerable. And what it actually ends up doing is shaving off the ladder of opportunity for them. And I think conservatives don't do a good job of explaining that at the human level. So I think my background in politics and in finance, I can sort of meld those two and explain the human cost to public policy.
So the minimum wage issue is probably one of the most polarizing questions in American politics today. And at our organization, the Millennial Action Project, we're trying to figure out how can this generation overcome the historic levels of polarization. Some research has found that the current polarization in the United States Congress is at the worst levels they've been since the Civil War. So this is a very unprecedented time in our lives to see all of this polarization and gridlock. And I just wonder how that is going to affect our generation as we think about careers. So what I want to do with this part of the panel is model an example of cross-partisanship on an issue that we both feel very passionate about. So you referenced minimum wage and poverty. Earlier we were talking about prison reform and immigration. Maybe, Michael, if you could walk us through an issue that you're particularly passionate about, could be one of these that I mentioned or a different one, and talk about how, specifically from your experience on the council, but also thinking about the larger national implications, what is an issue that has a high level of post-partisan potential, especially for our generation?
Well, I think the prison reform example you gave is a good one. When you have Newt Gingrich and Van Jones writing op-eds together on stage together, talking about we need to do something about this, that's exciting, right? Because when these two agree on anything. So, and what, that was a long question, so give it to me in pieces. So what was
Sure. Give us an example of, so you mentioned prison reform. Okay. Help us just walk through, and maybe you can offer some examples from your time on the city council in Stockton, where you have seen opportunities for the two sides to come together.
So an example would be back to the ex-offender thing, taking prison reform to a more micro level, because in California we have this thing called AB 109, where because of the overcrowding in prisons, because we could just incarcerate people for everything and put them there for very long times, for like stealing gum 3 times or something, 3 strikes. So the Supreme Court demanded that we had to release some people because the jails were overcrowded and all type of human rights violations. So now we have all these ex-offenders who've been incarcerated for 5 to 20 years who are back in our communities, and it's what are we going to do? And because of the pressing need to do something, because they're coming, they're here, we've been working across partisan lines to come up with an anti-recidivism program. So how do we get these men jobs? Where are some industries they could work in? What type of skills do they need? How do we support them? How do we build a safety net for them so they don't go back? We've been looking at our county jail and saying, okay, who's in jail and why? And we found that 70% of the people in jail were those waiting for a trial. They weren't even found guilty yet. They just couldn't pay their bond. So now we're working on a pre-trial assessment tool so we know who's a risk to the community, who's not, and those that aren't, they could go home to their court days so that we have space in jail for people who actually need to be there. So I think to answer your question more concretely, I think the level of inaction is going to cause these big social problems to fester to the point where there's going to have to be some cooperation for the issues to be solved, where everyone's best interests are going to be harmed. And that could be with schools, with prisons, with poverty, with minimum wage, with economic inequality. There's going to come a festering point where action has to happen. And it's going to take both sides to get it done, or else America's not going to be America.
Right. So I think you're speaking to what I think we're all seeing right now, which is really a breaking point in politics. I think the government shutdown last fall was an example of one of those breaking points where people realized, and the polls confirmed, that the American public is very concerned about polarization. And I think that if there is a silver lining from that, is there will be an opening for the millennial generation to come to the forefront with more pragmatic solutions. There's a researcher at Third Way, her name's Michelle Diggles, who does outstanding writing on and research on millennials, and she calls us the a la carte generation, in that we're willing to take ideas from both sides, and we don't care where it really comes from as long as it works. And so if you take an issue like prison reform, which I think is a fascinating, high potential area of cross-partisanship, where someone who can be staunchly conservative like Newt Gingrich or Grover Norquist can stay consistent to their ideology in terms of reducing the size of government, and then same thing on the flip side for progressives in terms of social justice. And I think that is going to be more and more common as millennials take office. So I want to pose the same question to you, Carrie. What do you see as a very high potential issue for post-partisanship, and perhaps one where you're seeing particularly the younger generation finding these pragmatic solutions?
Yeah. Well, I can say my specific issue, but I do want to jump and play off what Michael was saying from the perspective of a business community, so sort of the Chamber of Commerce crowd. I think for prison reform, I think that is a tremendous human capital potential there. So people who are coming out of prison, there's a startup organization that a friend of mine has introduced me to that is helping people who are coming out of prison to create business models and to get funding and seed funding. So I think there's a lot of potential there. And I worked for the Manhattan Institute think tank, policy think tank, and they've done a lot of work on prisoner recidivism, including they recently did a study about what's most effective in terms of, there's a federal program called America Works, and they were tracking the outcomes of America Works, and they found that there was differential outcomes for people who are violent offenders versus nonviolent offenders. For nonviolent offenders, it was much more effective, and so we need to continue that. But for violent offenders, we have to do something else because that's not working. So I think that was an important insight that the conservative Manhattan Institute policy think tank was able to discover. So I think there's a lot of interest, and I think with mandatory minimum sentencing, like you mentioned, the 3 strikes. I mean, I think that's something, for example, Rand Paul, who is on the more libertarian side, who is very pro-freedom, this is something, I mean, and for myself as well, I think this is something that really, resonates, that we need to look at these again and to say, these are kind of mindless policies that don't make sense. and they're not applied equally either. And there's, huge disparities. So, yeah, we just solved that problem.
Well, if you're looking for conflict, we need.
Yeah.
There we go.
All right.
Derek said he wanted more conflict, so maybe I'm trying to think of an issue where you disagree on. We need.
But I did want to talk about, so the issue that I was thinking about was welfare reform and sort of poverty. I mean, I'm very passionate about poverty. And so I think in 1996, we did see welfare reform, and we saw it with a Democrat in the White House and a Republican Congress. We're sort of in that scenario. If things happen in the fall, we're going to, most likely, the odds say we're going to have a Republican Senate. So I think we can reproduce what happened with welfare reform. And in that era, in 1996, we had millions of people who were lifted out of poverty thanks to the changes in the structure of these programs. So I think that's a place that both the left and the right can come together on.
That's great. So, Michael, I'm going to switch to you about, earlier we talked a little bit about running for office and how big of a decision that can be. How would you advise, if this breaking point is indeed going to be true, and we've seen this playing out in recent weeks, this anti-incumbent fervor among the American public will probably produce a lot of new candidates and elected officials in our democracy. And I would wonder what type of advice you would have for them in terms of how you practice politics in the 21st century, in the digital age. What are some of the new tools or strategies that you would advise them to utilize to make sure that they are really representing the future generations and the future of politics?
You ask really complicated questions. I'll do my best to answer. I think a couple things, right? So number one, I would say don't run for office if you don't want to do the work and you don't have something you're passionate about that you want to change. Don't just run because you want to run. There's too many people who are in office because they want to be an office holder, and that's why nothing gets done. It's frustrating to work with people like that. The second thing I would say is I think authenticity is so incredibly important. I think given just the access to information, how reality TV, life is so 24/7 now that people often feel the need to be on all the time. But I think, at least in Stockton politics, people really value authenticity. They value people who say, I don't know, when someone poses a question at the town hall, I'll get back to you. They value people who say, look, I'm having a bad day, so if I'm short and snappy with you, it's not your fault. I got 3 hours of sleep last night. They really value being who you are and being authentic, so don't run for office thinking you need to fit some prototype or script of what it means to be a politician. Just be yourself and do good work. And then number 3, just be prepared to work incredibly hard. A lot of these issues don't have answers, honestly, or a lot of the answers are things you can't do as an elected official. A lot of these answers you can do in concert with different government agencies. Like, for example, a lot of the issues I work on in the city are actually school district issues or county issues or statewide issues. But my constituents don't know that, so I have to like herd cats and dogs and try to figure out how to get a solution. So just be prepared for a certain number of complexity, and that everything you want to get accomplished won't be accomplished, at least in the 4 years, but there are opportunities for some wins.
So we have, to my understanding, over 10,000 people, if not more, young millennials who are tuned in right now, and as well as people who are here in the audience. Would you advise them to run for office if they want to make a difference in this country? They want to have an impact on whatever issue they're passionate about. Do you think running for office is kind of something you'd recommend for them?
Not to all 10,000 people, like I don't know them, but I think running for office is right for some people with the right skill sets, because running for office essentially is a people game. You have to be able to work with people. So if you don't like talking to people, don't run for office. But there's different roles, right? So maybe you're passionate about the issue and you don't want to be the elected official. Maybe you want to be someone's chief of staff, or maybe you want to work at the think tank, or maybe you want to do research, or maybe you want to, so I think there's different ways to engage in politics without necessarily being the politician. And I know I didn't answer your question, but that's what politicians do, so.
No, absolutely. A true politician. Well, I mean, the reason why I think this is an important issue, in fact, is because now we're seeing about half of the millennial generation doesn't believe that politics can solve the challenges facing our country. And we're, as a result, I think, seeing a movement towards still making social impact, but often in the private sector through entrepreneurial solutions. I found it interesting, the Coffin Foundation found that about 54% of our generation identifies as an entrepreneur. But I think you were making an interesting point, Michael, earlier, that those aren't substitutes necessarily. We still need good people, good young people, particularly in public service, especially if you look, throughout our history, a lot of positive change has been made by young people, from our founders to, Dr. King and others, all of millennial age, by the way, when they made their impact. So maybe you could just speak a little bit more to that in terms of perhaps there's not a direct substitution between this private sector work and public sector work.
Yeah, so to your point, I think there is a role for some people to be in government as elected officials, and that's an important job to have. I just wouldn't recommend all 10,000 do it, but I'm sure out of that 10,000, there's a number of whom will be excellent and great public officials, because I know with a lot of my friends, I get frustrated because they see government as a barrier, like government gets in the way, so let me just create this app, or let me just create this nonprofit and do it. But I think in terms of scale, you have to work with government. Like the social impact bonds are so exciting because the government can take these great ideas to scale in a way that you can't. So I think getting people to engage more with government and also running for office is incredibly important. And I would also say, to your point, that is absolutely correct. Throughout history, when there's any great change in this country, it starts with young people, whether it was a 26-year-old preacher, Dr. King, in Montgomery, the 18, 19-year-olds who were freedom riders and did the sit-ins, whether it was the founding father. Like, throughout history, there's always been or the Vietnam War. Like, so throughout the history, anytime there's been like massive change or solutions to festering social issues in our country, it's been when young people decided enough was enough and really got involved and active.
That's right. And one thing I constantly draw inspiration from is from our founders, who in fact mostly were under the age of 40. In 1776, Jefferson submitted the Declaration of Independence to Congress when he was 33 years old, so of millennial age. And also James Madison, first elected to the Second Continental Congress when he was 29 years old. And today, in our United States Congress, those would be some of the youngest members. In fact, Madison at 29 would be the youngest member of Congress. There are 0 currently 0 20-somethings in Congress. So I think that's a really great point. Speaking of these sort of political sort of generational changes in politics, Carrie, you've been in the journalism world, and I'm curious your take on this whole blogging revolution and the new practice of journalism in the 21st century. We were talking earlier about the often unsubstantiated arguments made in the national commentary, and that's perhaps occurring increasingly so given the increased access to commentary. So I'm curious your thoughts on how we make sure we still have sort of thoughtful, substantiated commentary even in this new digital age.
Yeah. So I think short answer, 140 characters, don't fight on Twitter. I try to avoid fighting on Twitter. I prefer Facebook because you can be more thoughtful, or you can give longer answers. But no, I think it's always been a balance. I mean, going back to Thomas Paine and his pamphlets that were distributed that were, ignited interest in the revolution. I mean, public writing and public discourse, I mean, that's in our lifeblood. So I don't have a problem with people getting engaged, and I think it's wonderful that people are getting engaged, whether it's blogging or what have you. I think there is the danger, going back to taking those gatekeepers out of the way, there is a danger of sometimes things might be inaccurate, and so I think the counter to that, though, is that there is the wisdom of the crowd in the sense that if something is inaccurate, I think people will be pretty vigilant about pointing out what's wrong. And I think, for example, Wikipedia, I mean, I love Wikipedia, and I think there are some really great people who monitor that to make sure that what is presented is objective and is nuanced and gives all sides. But I wanted to talk actually a little bit about what you were mentioning about millennials feeling like they didn't want to turn to government per se. And I think as a conservative, I don't necessarily have a problem with that in the sense that I want to have a small, limited, smart government. So if millennials are going and doing things in the social entrepreneur space, in the intersection of business and government, I think that is wonderful. And I think that is what the founders envisioned with the American experiment, which was that we were completely separate from this really, really stratified and the British system, that it was based on who your father was, and it was just sort of this basically like a caste system in the UK. And we broke away from that because we wanted to have a government that let people flourish on their own. And I think as a conservative, I think my knee-jerk reaction is to say that government can often do a lot of really bad things. And when you look in society, the worst experiments have happened from government. So I think it's great that people are doing things and solving social issues outside of government, because I think we have that power within ourselves, and I think sometimes government gets in the way.
No, that's a really great point, and obviously we have many social entrepreneurs who are tuned in here, and Michael earlier mentioned the social impact bonds, and related to that, there's the new Social Innovation Fund. The government, often more likely than not, is not going to come up with the most innovative solution to address poverty or some of these other issues at the ground level. But to Michael's point, I think there is this issue of scale. And so how can the government be sort of a partner to the private sector in scaling those solutions? I just have to mention also on the social impact bonds, this is an idea that has both the left and right support. Another example of a cross-partisan issue. You have everyone from the Center for American Progress to the American Enterprise Institute. We have the leading sponsor of this in the House is actually a Republican, working with the Obama White House because President Obama included it in his budget proposal called Pay for Success. So I think this is another great example, actually, of cross-partisanship, is a relationship between social entrepreneurs and public policy. I wanted to also just ask you a follow-up question about the new practice of journalism in the digital age. Do you feel like, obviously you feel like you're having an impact on the national debate. If we have any budding commentators in the audience, how would you advise them in terms of thinking about being a national commentator and the sort of impact or not that you could have on the major policy questions of our day?
I'm not sure I fully understand what
So
you're saying.
This is like a career track that you think has a lot of impact on public policy.
Well, I think it can definitely shape the debate. I think whether you're writing, maybe you have a full-time job and you're writing on the side, you're getting engaged in the dialogue. I think if you choose to make it your full-time career, I mean, it's all about. I think if you're producing good content, that cream will sort of rise to the top. And so I think if you're just producing noise, then it will just sort of get lost in that noise. So I think it can be a very unstable career. People are getting laid off. There's all these startups. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think journalism is going through, as they say, the creative destruction phase. And the creative part is exciting. The destruction part is kind of scary. You have a lot of more mid-career seasoned journalists who are getting laid off because they're more expensive and being replaced by millennials. So in that sense, it's great for millennials. But I mean, I think it's rewarding. I enjoy it. I enjoy writing and thinking and speaking and engaging with people on these issues. So I think it's hard to quantify, I think. Exactly, but that's the nature of democracy, is that how do you quantify impact? I mean, I think it's sort of an organic endeavor.
I think that makes sense. As we're starting to reach the close of this session, I want to pose a question to each of you, which is, again, as Derek mentioned, this is the first time that MCON is shining a spotlight on politics and policy. And again, I do want to thank Derek Feldman and our friends at the Case Foundation and others who really advocated for making sure that we do have a focus on this topic. In this last minute here, Michael, I'll start with you. What would you say has been the most fulfilling part of being an elected official, being in politics, especially as a millennial?
And I know I don't have a lot of time, so let me go fast. I would say the most fulfilling part would be, so by nature, I don't like asking people for stuff. I just rather just do it, right? So so the most fulfilling part is able to just do it. Like, I don't have to ask somebody for band-in-the-box, I could do it. I don't have to ask somebody about police presence in my neighborhood, I could do it. So just having the agency and the ability to really make impact, especially for the people I know intimately well, because the district I represent is the district I grew up in. So my teachers, my schools, like, it's a really, really special relationship. So I think that's the thing I'm most proud of, and slash, comma, semicolon, run-on sentence. The other thing I would say I'm proud of is just how the story has been really inspiring a lot of people to get involved. In Stockton, but also nationwide, there's a young man in Chicago, Corey Hardiman, who's running for office, who texted me like 2 years ago when he found out I was running, saying, hey, I'm thinking about coming and running back home in Chicago. There's one of my fellow interns in the White House just made it past the primary in Fresno, so she's going to the runoff in November. So seeing people demystifying the democratic process, and people could see that, oh, I have a stake in this, I could be the decision maker, and I don't have to be 100 years old to do it.
Right. Carrie, in just a few seconds, best part of shaping the national debate from the national commentary standpoint.
The best part? I mean, a few different things. I think it's very exciting. It's really fun. You get a front row seat to history. I was there when Nancy Pelosi was sworn in as the first female Speaker of the House. I mean, that was incredibly historic. I was there when President Obama was sworn in, and I was there in Colorado when he got the nomination at the convention. And, even though I disagree with their politics, those were both very incredible moments in the sense that this is history in the making. So I think that's exciting. And then in terms of just, shaping the conversation and fighting for what I believe in, I find that to be invigorating, and I just enjoy it. So.
That's great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but please join me in thanking our incredible panelists.